February, of course, is Black History Month. March is Women's History Month. And this comes after January when our country finally sees the first woman of color in the White House. That's not the First Lady. This morning, we welcome editor and author Michael G. Long to discuss a figure in sports history who continues to play a significant role in the progress of today's landscape. Good morning, Michael. How are you?
Hey, Bobby, great to be with you.
So you are the author and editor of three other books on the late, great Jackie Robinson. But today our focus is your latest on Jackie, 42 Today, Jackie Robinson and His Legacy. What is Jackie's legacy in the civil rights movement?
Rachel Robinson describes her late husband as an informal civil rights leader. And I think she's right about that. From 1956 to 1972, Robinson played a huge role in the civil rights movement. He worked for the NAACP for a while. That is, he volunteered for the NAACP. He worked closely with Dr. King in Albany, Georgia, and then in the Birmingham movement. He spoke at the March on Washington in the preliminary program and marched with his family. He opened a black bank in downtown Harlem so that black folks there could get decent loans at decent rates. He worked on community affairs with Nelson Rockefeller. He battled with Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, and the list goes on. He was really a formative player in the civil rights movement, and not a whole lot of people know that. So I'm glad you mentioned that. His legacy is unfulfilled. He had a big dream like Dr. King, and that dream of racial reconciliation and peace and economic justice for everybody is certainly unfulfilled today.
So Jackie breaks the color barrier in 1947 with the Brooklyn Dodgers. He passes away in 1972. And honestly, when you think about it, we haven't really seen that much growth ever since. So in your opinion, how, when will we see this kind of growth that Jackie Robinson dreamed of?
Well, if we just look at Major League Baseball alone, the questions are troubling, aren't they? So when he left in 56, 5.6% of all rosters were of black players. Today, that figure has increased by what, a 1 or 2%? Really dismal. Robinson would be definitely upset about that. He'd be upset about the lack of color in front offices and in manager positions. So if we look at Major League Baseball alone, wow, what are the answers? I just saw that Major League Baseball hired Ken Griffey Jr. to take on issues of diversity and urban development. And the job is monumental. He has social forces to combat, like the lack of green space and poverty. It takes a lot of money, as you know, to have a baseball team, and some of that is just not available in some of our inner city neighborhoods. He's also up against the problems of the game itself, the sport itself. It lacks the sexiness, the romance of the NBA and the NFL. So there are lots of problems there, aren't there? I wish I knew the answer, but I wish Ken Griffey Jr. in Major League Baseball all my very best. I think we can start definitely by adding some color to the front offices and seeing some changes of perspectives there. When the perspectives change, the structures change. And when the structures change, more perspectives change.
You bring up Ken Griffey Jr., in your opinion, what role can athletes play in challenging social injustice? Because, lately we've seen a lot of pushback in regards to some other NBA stars, someone like LeBron James. And then, of course, the big story still years later, we're still talking about Kaepernick in the NFL.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. Robinson was always hard on his fellow players who didn't stand up for racial justice. And here I'm thinking of Campanella, especially, and Don Newcombe. He was also disappointed with Willie Mays and some other black players, including, by the way, Frank Robinson. He thought Frank Robinson should have spoken out a lot more. Robinson was a big believer in the bully pulpit. And so I can't imagine that he wouldn't be pleased with the platform that LeBron James has and uses through social media. I mean, the guy's influence is enormous. All he has to do is tweet out something, and people either rally around him or they hurl the N-word at him. And sometimes and often both happen, right? I think that social media platform is a good start. I really do. I think that using Twitter and using, well, they use Facebook so much, using Twitter especially has been super for moving people into protests and rallies and marches. So hats off, I think, to Kaepernick, hats off to LeBron James and others whom I think Robinson would support.
I think anyone that has seen the film 42 will have that great moment in their mind when Pee Wee Reese puts his arm around Jackie in 1947. But some say it never happened, and that's something that's addressed in this book.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. Rachel Robinson and contributor Jonathan Ogg, who, by the way, wrote a great book on Muhammad Ali, make the case that Pee Wee Reese in early 47 anyway never really went over to Robinson and put his arm around Robinson and racism suddenly disappeared from the diamond. That didn't happen. It seems that Pee Wee Reese didn't walk over to Robinson and put his arm around him. And Rachel believes, and I think Jonathan Ogg believes as well, that that myth has served those of us who are white pretty well. It gets us off the hook, doesn't it? Because here we are helping Robinson along the way, when in fact, according to Rachel, Robinson had the help of one white man, Branch Rickey, and bore the struggle for the most part alone. And one of my favorite images that Rachel has given me is that Robinson would come home late at night after the game, and he would go into his bedroom and kneel by the bed and say his prayers to God for strength and courage. That's an image of a lone man, a lonesome man, a lonely man. And that's the type of figure I think Robinson was in early 47. Whites did not, were not the pioneers with Jackie Robinson in early 47.
So we mentioned it earlier too. 3 books for you. Now you edit this particular book about Jackie. Why are you so interested in Jackie Robinson's story?
Initially, I got into Robinson through his politics, believe it or not. Now, growing up, I read the Robinson biographies about him turning the other cheek, a nice smiling young baseball player who treated everybody well. And then I read this thick stack of letters between Robinson and President Nixon at National Archives in California, and I was hooked. This was a Robinson I hadn't grown up with. This was a Robinson I didn't know. This was a Robinson who was full of fury about the lack of first-class citizenship for Black Americans. And in his letters to Nixon, he wrote about politics, economics, civil rights, sports, yes, and other issues. And so I was hooked. I have this great interest in civil rights. And when I came across these fiery letters, this Robinson I didn't know, I just felt the need to share it more with the world. And I contacted Rachel shortly after that, and she gave me permission to write about her husband. And my first book was a book of his civil rights letters. So I got into Robinson that way, and I've stuck with him ever since because there's always something new to find out about this complicated, nuanced, complex, deep man called Jack Robinson.
Well, Jackie Robinson, an amazing man, and his story is still very important, I would say, today. I mean, maybe even more so today, Michael.
I think more so today. The struggle continues, doesn't it? I mentioned Major League Baseball earlier, but let's look at police brutality for another case. And Robinson was very concerned about police brutality throughout his life. He was a victim of police brutality just before going to UCLA, and then shortly after that as well. So he knew what it felt like to have the gun of a police officer sticking in his back, even though he was innocent. He knew and felt police brutality. And while he was not inclined to side with Malcolm X and his call for the use of any means necessary, by the end of his life, Robinson stood side by side with the Black Panthers, and he supported their right to self-defense when the police did not protect them. And so Robinson's relevance to me is all the more visible when police brutality continues to rear its ugly head in contemporary America. And that has happened since Robinson died, and especially in the past couple of years. So the Black Lives Matter movement that has bubbled up in recent years, I think, is in line with Robinson's legacy.
Readers will find hope and inspiration in this story of great struggle and sacrifice. Filmmakers, writers, journalists, scholars, activists celebrate the man behind the number 42. 42 today, Jackie Robinson and his legacy is available at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and all major retailers. Michael, thank you for spending some time with us this morning.
Thanks, Bobby. Let's get out there and play ball.
Sounds good to me.